Assalamu alaikum. Just want to welcome you guys all to our interfaith event. It's called Justice and Faith. So we should get started. I want to make sure that the speakers get enough time to speak for the next 1 hour. So let me introduce the speakers first. So on my far right, which might be your far left, I guess. I'm not sure how it works, but we have Pastor William Starkweather, who's originally from Marietta, Georgia. He graduated from Kennesaw State University with a degree in Human Services. He then worked for a year with at-risk youth in Canton before he pursued his ordained ministry. He did that at Luther's Seminary in St. Paul's, Minnesota, and he spent the first 2 years as a youth director. Then he completed his vicarage at Christ Church Lutheran in Minneapolis. Could you explain to us quickly what vicarage is? Yeah. Okay.
So before being ordained as a pastor, one while they're in seminary serves a vicarage as an intern, learn the tools of the trade, so to speak.
Okay, and then basically he served in Hudson Valley. He was there at the Lutheran parish, and when he was there, he participated in a lot of different community organizations. And he served on the innovation team at the Metropolitan of the New York Synod. He's been here at the St. Martin Evangelical Lutheran Church since 2017. And what he continues to focus on is worship and pastoral care and the faith in the daily life. And he lives here with his daughter, Ryan, here in Sugar Land. So thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And so I think we all know our imam here, but just let me do a bit of a biography for him in case someone's new. Short, okay. So he graduated from Zaytuna, and he was the valedictorian of his class. And he has a degree in liberal arts, in Islamic law and theology. When he was in Zaytuna, he focused on the Islamic scholarly tradition and its relationship with modern thought. He is also a master, a level reciter in the Quran. He's been here since 2019, and he's the imam and the senior religious director. And his focus is on inclusivity, as well as the restoration of the family institution. So thanks a lot, Imam, for joining us as well. Okay. So let me start, guys, with I'll read just a quote here, okay? And what it says is, a justice is indiscriminately due to all without regard of numbers, wealth, or rank. And this is by John Jay, who was the first Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. And unless you've been completely cut off from the news, you would have noticed that there's a sense of injustice often in a lot of a discourse that's taking place and a whole lot of different events. And as religious folks, I guess we have to speak about this stuff. And from you guys, I guess we'll get a perspective that will reflect on scripture as well. So Pastor, I'll start with you. And so from your faith tradition, could you explain us the concept of justice?
3 minutes or less, right? Boil it down. Well, thank you again for having me. And justice is certainly one of those big concepts. And, I could probably talk for the next 3 hours about justice, but I'll spare you that. But when I think about justice, I think there's a couple of passages from the Christian and Hebrew scriptures that come to mind. The first is from the Hebrew scriptures. And of course, Christians, 2/3 of what we consider scripture is the Hebrew scriptures, what we call the Old Testament. And so the prophet Micah writes, he has shown you, God has shown you, oh man, what is good and what is required of you, but to do justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly with God. And so from there, we see that justice is a requirement for faithful living. And justice can't be divorced from mercy. Justice and mercy are two sides of the same coin. I also think about a passage from Christian scriptures. There are, by some estimates, 613 laws or commandments in the Torah of the Hebrew scriptures. And a lawyer came to Jesus and asked him, "Teacher, what is the central law? What is the most important of all of the commandments in the Torah?" And Jesus says there are two that hold everything together. The first is love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. And the second, that first comes from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 6. The second comes from Leviticus, chapter 19. He says, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." And so for me, I think of that commandment when we talk about justice, because justice is seen in love, in loving our neighbor and caring for one another. And ultimately, justice is, I believe, a restoring of things to the way they ought to be. Injustice is when something is out of balance. And so justice is restoring that balance, restoring that relationship. And that brings me to the other scripture that often comes to mind for me. And that is from Genesis chapter 1, the creation story. And God looks at everything that God has made and says, "This is very good." Everything is exactly the way that the Creator intends for it to be. And so when we have injustice, it's taking what God has created and called good and breaking that in some way. For Christians, we call that sin. Sin is both the act and the state of brokenness. And justice is making reparation. There's a beautiful concept that I've learned from Judaism called tikkun olam, the repair of the world. And that for me is the heart of what justice is. It's the repair of the world. It's the repair of what's broken. In some ways, I'm very, I regret deeply that we don't have a rabbi with us tonight to expound more on the Hebrew scriptures. In another way, I'm a little bit relieved because there's no one to correct me on what I get wrong. So, but this concept of the repair of the world, the restoring of things to God's created goodness. And what so many Christians, I think, have gotten away from understanding about this concept of resurrection and the kingdom of God. So many Christians think about the kingdom of God as when we all get to heaven, when we die, when we all go wherever God is. But so much of Scripture in the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian scriptures refers to God making new and restoring what's already here. That resurrection and new life in the kingdom of God isn't taking us out of this world and putting us in the next, but restoring this world to what God envisioned it could be. And we have a part in that. God requires justice and mercy and humility of all of us.
That was very moving. MashaAllah. When we think about justice, we think about God, because God is the one, the owner of justice. Justice is a term that can be very relative, especially in the modern day, right? We've seen many, many problematic situations. And I'm not going to really name them, but we know them, right? We live in today's world. We watch the news. No, there are not fine people on both sides, right? We know that there is something morally wrong when we see injustice happen, when we see racism happen, when we see poverty happen, right? 2/3 of the world is impoverished still, right? We live in the 21st century. And so what does justice mean? And so the verse that comes to my mind is a very powerful verse in the Quran. It's in the 4th chapter, 135th or the 37th verse. God says, Ya ayyuhan nas. And this is the beauty, right? He's not addressing the people who believe in the book of God. He's saying, O mankind, Ya ayyuhan nas, kunu qawwamina bil qisti shuhada'a lillah. Right? That be people of justice, right? And be witnesses before God. And so when he sent Adam onto this earth, he sent him as a khalifa, right? Now, the word khalifa can be, if we take it at its literal sense, can be a problematic translation. Because khalifa literally means the heir, right? So there is no heir to God in the Islamic tradition. But what we can see it as is a representative of God. He was bringing the teachings of God onto mankind. And so therefore, those teachings allow us to be people of justice, to be people of equity. There's a very, very beautiful prophetic tradition that we had a whole sermon on a few days ago, and I'm going to try to do it in like 2 minutes. Okay? So again, the Prophet Muhammad, he echoes the same sort of line of thought that God did in the Quran. He says, Ya ayyuhan nas. He says, O mankind, ala inna rabbakum wahidun. Let me tell you that you only have one Lord, right? And you have inna abakum wahidun. That you stem from one father, right? Which is Adam. Peace and blessings be upon him. Yani all of creation came from Adam. And we are all created equal under the supremacy of God. Yani we all came from the same originator, right? So there's nothing different about us. And then he breaks it down. He says that there is no virtue of an Arab over a non-Arab. There is no virtue over a light-skinned person, right? Often translated as white-skinned person over a dark-skinned person. And there is no virtue of a dark-skinned person over a light-skinned person, illa bittaqwa, except with the consciousness of God, right? Except with the consciousness of God. The reason we have this is that without God telling us what is justice, justice will always remain relative. Because what is good for me may not be good for you, and what is good for you may not be good for me. So for us to understand this at a universal level, and as Pastor Will so beautifully said, we have a concept that, justice in Arabic, it means adl, right? It comes from the root adala ya'dilu, right? To fashion correctly, in other words. But another verb that it is related to is adaba ya'dibu. Have you guys heard of the word adab? Right? We have it in Urdu, and it's the same meaning that is in Arabic. It's both in Urdu and in Arabic. Adaba ya'dibu means to put things in their proper places, right? And so an adib is a what? Is a poet, right? The person who knows how to put words in his proper places. And so in order for us to be adil, be people of justice, we first have to be able to place justice in the right places. And I'll give you a quick example. Right? So, for example, let's say that I'm a judge, right? I'm a judge. And a person is convicted of murder, right? First degree murder. And I sentence this person to death. Is that just? According to the law of the land, right? Would that be just? Yes or no? Okay, yes. All right. Now, let's say that we take a random person and we kill that person. Would that be just? No, but the act is similar, right? But the reasoning is different. So that reasoning is what allows justice to universally be considered that term. And Aristotle goes in length in his book, the Nicomachean Ethics. He talks about these terminologies, right? Like what is being cowardice versus being courageous, right? If somebody comes and attacks your family and you say, I want to be patient, I want to look the other way, that's not considered patience, that's considered cowardice. On the opposite end, you see 100 people in front of you instead of calling the cops or going in the other direction, that wouldn't be called courageous, right? So we have to understand terms for what they are. And so if we want to be true people of justice, we have to be able to fashion things in their proper order. And how do we do that? We do that through revelation. Our understanding is mapped by revelation, because there was a time in this country where people of color were not able to vote. Women were not able to vote, right? And so is that justice? According to that time, for that law, yes, it was. But according to Islam, it never was. According to Islam, it was never justice, right? So I hope.
You raise an interesting point there with putting things in their proper place. And I'm reminded of the prophets. There's this point in the prophet, I believe it's the prophet Jeremiah. He talks about unrighteous scales. And it always kind of struck me. Every time I came across it, it's kind of a strange term, because I think a lot of people tend to think about righteousness as a moral quality. Righteousness is that upstanding quality. And he refers to unrighteous scales as these scales that are being used in the marketplace with false weights. And the weights aren't proper, and so people are being cheated in their deals. And the scale is unrighteous not because it has a morality, but because it doesn't do what it was intended to do. And righteousness then becomes the quality of doing what we were made to do. And so a table is righteous if it holds up what's set on it. If I put my dinner on the table and the table collapses and it falls on the floor, it's not doing what a table was made to do. If I sit down in a chair and it collapses under my weight, I probably need to stop eating so much, but the chair isn't doing what it was intended to do. And in the same way, when we talk about righteousness in people, what are people created to do? What is the purpose of human beings? And so righteousness, there's a passage in Genesis chapter 12. God calls Abraham, and he tells him to go, and Abraham goes. And then in chapter 15, God makes this promise to Abraham, and Abraham believes in God, and it says God reckoned that to him as righteousness. That the purpose of a human being is to trust God. But the other purpose of a human being is to care for our neighbor. We are our brothers and our sisters' keeper. That question that Cain asks, am I my brother's keeper, after slaying his brother Abel? He is, and he knows that he is. And so righteousness, fulfilling our intended purpose, putting things where they're supposed to be. When we see someone who has a need, the righteous thing to do is to fill that need, and not to stop and ask whether they deserve it, not to stop and ask whether they can repay me later, but because that's how God created us, to care for one another. We're created for community. I see so often the examples of Jesus in the Gospels, and he cared for people's needs. He would heal them. He would heal a person's withered hand. He would heal a person's muteness or their blindness or their deafness. And occasionally he did that on the Sabbath, and healing on the Sabbath was forbidden. Work on the Sabbath was forbidden. And the Pharisees, the religious leaders of the time, would attack Jesus for that. They'd say, why would you do that on the Sabbath? You know the laws. You're not supposed to be working on the Sabbath. And Jesus says, what's the right thing to do on the Sabbath? To take a life or to give life? If your animal falls in a ditch and needs to be taken out, don't you go out even on the Sabbath and pull the animal out of the ditch? So healing is righteous, even if it takes place on the Sabbath. Caring for our neighbor's need is righteous, no matter the circumstances.
You saying this brings up a point in my head too.
Yes.
One thing when we think about justice and faith, right? Justice and faith, we think that justice is limited to people of our faith, right? That if this is a Muslim country, then we are able to be unjust to people of all other faiths. And that's just not the reality that the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, brought forth, right? Just because you are not a Muslim doesn't mean that your life is not valuable, does not mean that your property is not valuable, because that which Islam came to secure for the believers really came to secure for all of humanity. And that's why a lot of the verses which in regards to our moral and ethical paradigm, they don't begin with Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu. It doesn't believe, oh you who believe. It begins with Ya ayyuhan nas, right? So like another verse that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala he brings up in the beginning of Surah Nisa. He says, Ya ayyuhan nas, O mankind, we created you from one man and one woman, right? And we put you in different nations and tribes so that you would get to know each other. So that just because you're from a different nation or you're from a different tribe does not mean that this term justice begins to change, right? And so when we talk about justice in faith, what we mean is that how faith is informing us in terms of justice. Because like I gave the example of the constitutional example, right? That man-made law is relative, right? It's relative. But God's law, in a way, and when I say law, I mean tradition, right? What God tells us to do in terms of our moral and ethical paradigm, the framework of our moral and ethical paradigm, is that it makes it universal. That just because this person is not my mother, it is someone else's mother. Just because this person is not my brother, they are someone else's brother. And so we have to care for them like we would care for our own needs. And this really brings up another prophetic tradition that is fairly quoted quite often, but we really don't discuss it from this vantage. The Prophet Muhammad, he said, peace and blessings be upon him, that none of you will truly believe. None of you will truly believe until you love for your brothers and sisters in humanity, not in the ummah, right? Not in the believers, but in humanity, what you love for yourself. Do we not love justice? I mean, show of hands who loves justice. Show of hands. If you don't raise your hand, right? So we all love justice. So then we must love that for everyone else as well.
Jesus so often taught using parables, using stories. And in the Gospel according to St. Luke, Jesus tells the parable of the Good Samaritan. And it's exactly an example of what you just raised. There's this setup of three people come across a man who's been attacked, who's been violently attacked, who's been left for dead. A priest comes along, a Levite comes along, and the expectation is that your everyday Israelite comes along behind. And Jesus upsets that a little bit and says it's a priest, a Levite, and a Samaritan. And that doesn't even sound like the start of a joke. That's offensive to Jesus' audience. Samaritans were the enemy. The Samaritans were the people who Jews of his day considered them half-breeds because the northern kingdom of Israel had been wiped out by the Assyrians, and they had brought in foreign people to live together and to mingle those beliefs. And so the Samaritans had a kind of Jewish faith and a kind of other faith. And the Jews and Samaritans did not get along. And Jesus says, the priest and the Levite, they go by on the other side, and there's an assumption that there's some kind of religious reason for that. There are prohibitions against coming into contact with blood, against coming into contact with a dead body, and there's an assumption that maybe this priest, maybe this Levite, they're on their way to fulfill their duty in the temple. And so they can't come into contact with blood because it will render them unclean. But the Samaritan comes along, someone from a different nation, from a different background, from a different faith, and he sees a person in need, takes him to an inn, pays all the expenses, says, take care of everything this man needs. And if it costs you more than I've already given you, when I come back, I'll pay you the difference. And it's a recognition that it's not a person's background, it's not a person's faith that makes them righteous, it's a person's actions. By the same token, so many of the times that Jesus rails against people in the Gospels, and for that matter, so many times that the prophets rail against injustice in the Hebrew Scriptures. What they're speaking out against are people who practice empty religion. They're very eloquent with their prayers, they're very pious with their acts, they perform the rituals, and they maybe keep the letter of the law, but they don't do justice. They don't care for their neighbor. They're just empty words. And the prophet Amos tells us that God goes so far as to say, I despise your festivals. I don't want to hear your singing. I'm not going to look on your sacrifices because you've overlooked your neighbor's need. Why should I look on your sacrifices when you won't look on what your neighbor needs? God says what God desires is that justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. That is true religion. True religion is lived out. It looks like something. In the New Testament, the Christian scriptures, James writes that faith by itself, apart from works, is dead. Now, Martin Luther, who is the founder of my own denomination, absolutely hated James. He had a big thing about that people are justified by grace through faith apart from works. You don't have to earn your salvation. And yes, Martin Luther, the German monk, 15th century German monk. Thank you, not Martin Luther King Jr., the civil rights leader. I grew up in Georgia. No one knew who Martin Luther, the German monk, was. And I think that, far be it for me to disagree from someone wiser than me, but I think that Martin Luther misunderstood what James was saying, because James isn't talking about salvation. James isn't talking about what saves your soul, but he's talking about what faith looks like. And he says that if I see someone in need and I just offer them a blessing, I say, go in peace, I hope you're well fed later. I haven't fed him, and I really haven't done anything. But if we take time to actually do for our neighbor what our neighbor needs, that's faith in action. And so faith and love and hope, these are all verbs. They look like something. They're actions. They're played out.
I guess just trying to get the hang of this a new world that we live in, I guess. So the story that you told, right? There was a stratification in society, right? There was the Samaritans you mentioned were at the bottom rung, right? And now this question. So recently we've been hearing this word privilege a lot, all right? So we've heard this kind of in social justice discourse. So I would like you guys to try to address that from your own faith. And one question that I had about that is, why does God privilege some people, right? And I think growing up back in the day, that was considered almost a good thing to be privileged. You kind of saw that as a blessing from God. So if you guys can speak about that a bit.
I think I went first last time. It's your turn.
So, why is there suffering in this world, right? Why is there any kind of evil in this world? Why are there people that, drive $3 million vehicles while others die in hunger? Why is all of this? I don't think there's a way for us to blame God, right? I don't think there's a way for us to blame God for that. As we've been sort of talking that, we have to be able to fashion things in the right order. Is it okay for me to have a $3 million vehicle while, in my same city, someone doesn't have food? Yes and no. In a way, right? It's like God created both good and evil. God created all actions. But He gave us free will. He gave us the ability to intend whatever we will. So so there's something in the Islamic theological tradition that I find sort of unique, and it's not necessarily unique, but we've just defined it at that level. So we believe that God has two types of will. In Urdu and in Arabic, this would be called irada, right? We have two types of irada when it comes to God. We have the ontological will, and we have the generative will. So the ontological will is that which God wants to create, right? So if I want to smoke, God doesn't want me to smoke, right? But if I intend it, then God will create in me the ability to do so. So the ontological will would be that I don't touch it, right? But the generative will is that I inevitably have the ability to then go ahead and do something that God doesn't want me to do. So God has made us custodians over all of the blessings that we have. And God, specifically mentions that in the Quran, that we have made you custodians over the blessings. Okay? Now, if we intend selfishness, then that is what will happen. But if we again go back to fashioning our sort of our mind, body, and spirit on the basis of revelation, and the only way we'll do that is we find value in that revelation. If we find value in having revelation, like, so for example, right, there's engineers, there's doctors in this room, there's attorneys. Now, if, let's say Ursulan, he's an attorney, he says, Imam Ahmed, I think you need to fill out this form. And I say no, right? And I lose everything, right? I lose everything. Whose fault was that? That was my fault, right? Because I didn't place value in what he was telling me. So similarly, God is telling us what is beneficial for humanity, that we share, that we care. I mean, the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, he said that if you go to sleep while your neighbor is hungry, Jannah is erased from you. You cannot enter paradise if you do this, right? And neighbor, interestingly, when we think about neighbor in modernity, what do we think about? What's a neighbor? The person in front of us, the person next to us, left, right, that's it. The triangle is complete. These are our neighbors. At the most, we'll think about the people on our street, right? But the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, when he said neighbor, he meant 40 people in front of you, 40 people behind you, 40 people to the right of you, and 40 people to the left of you. That, there should not be technically such a socio-economic imbalance in your locality, that one person has all of the wealth and the rest have nothing. So when we look at blessings and privilege from that vantage, what I would also like us to think about is that we are all blessed, every single one of us, no matter what it looks like. Every single one of us is blessed. We're just blessed differently. And we should definitely, absolutely be moving towards a more socioeconomic balance. But just because we don't have it doesn't mean that we begin to damn the world either, right? And that is also, what we see in the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, right? So one time he was, sitting with his wife Aisha, Siddiqa radiallahu ta'ala anha, and he knelt over. He knelt over in pain. And so Aisha asked him, Ya Rasulullah, O Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, what is the matter? What's going on? He goes, I'm really hungry. Like, I'm really hungry. This was what the Prophet ﷺ said. And so Aisha Siddiqa radiallahu ta'ala anha, she asked him, why don't you raise your hands? Why don't you raise your hand and order some food? Right? Like, I mean, if Musa, alayhi salatu wasalam, Musa, peace and blessings be upon him, his followers could get food from the sky, which is called manna, right, in the Abrahamic faiths, and in Arabic, manna salwa, right? So if that can happen for the followers of Musa, why can't that happen for the Prophet of God, Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him? And he was an example. He's a timeless example for us, that what do you do when you outwardly don't have the monetary blessings that you seek? And what should you do? Does that mean you shouldn't have them? No. But does that mean that you damn others for having them? No, that we're patient, that we give thanks to God. And he said, I'm going to eat one day and I'm going to show gratitude the next. And this is my prophetic tradition.
I love that you raised the topic of neighbor. And there's a Presbyterian minister by the name of Fred Rogers. You may know him as Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. He's responsible for both my upbringing and my theology. I love Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and I love now introducing that to my daughter, 6. But one of the things I've come to appreciate about Fred Rogers, now that I'm a pastor, is his use of the word neighbor. In every show, he'd come on and he'd say, won't you be my neighbor? And he was saying this to children in living rooms all across this country. He was in Pittsburgh area, but all across the country, Fred Rogers had neighbors because he knew that a neighbor isn't a geographic thing. It isn't a proximity thing, but it's how you treat one another. You talk about why is there suffering? There's a story that a pastor had seen a news report about suffering in an African country, that people were starving, that children were starving. He knelt down and he prayed fervently to God, God, why don't you do something about all that suffering that's going on over there? And God chose to speak to him. God said, I did. I made you. What are you doing? And so we have this responsibility. One of the parables that Jesus told, the last parable he told in the Gospel according to St. Matthew, he tells what's sometimes referred to either as the parable of the Last Judgment or the parable of the sheep and the goats. And it's a time of reckoning. All the people of the world come before the judge. And as they come forward, he separates them, the righteous to the right and the unrighteous to the left. And when the righteous ask, what did we ever do? Jesus says, you saw me hungry and you fed me. You saw me thirsty and you gave me something to drink. You saw me naked and you clothed me. You saw me homeless and you sheltered me. You saw me sick or in prison, you visited me. And they say, when did we ever do any of that? We don't remember doing this for you. And he says, whatever you did for the least of these my children, you did it for me. And then the unrighteous come. And they say, Lord, when did we not come visit you? When did we not take care of your needs? He says, whatever you didn't do for the least of these, you didn't do it for me. And so we're shown that we do all have blessings, and we're given so much. And the great theologian Uncle Ben from Spider-Man said that with great power comes great responsibility. I love Spider-Man. But there's truth. With great blessing, with great power, comes great responsibility. Those who have much responsibility. You know, we talk so much in this country about my rights. My rights are being jeopardized. My rights are being taken. It's my right that I can do this, that I can do that. We don't talk enough about my responsibility. We're a community. We belong to each other. Across race, across ethnicity, across religion, across socioeconomic background, across everything, every man-made division we can come up with, we belong to each other. And so, yes, I have rights, but I have a responsibility to my neighbor. It's been said that my right to swing my fist ends where my neighbor's nose begins. I don't get to hit you just because I can swing my arm around. I have a responsibility to care for you. Martin Luther, in his small catechism, his explanation, catechism is the teaching tool of the church. And he's explaining the Ten Commandments, and he talks about the fourth commandment. The fifth commandment. That's embarrassing. You shall not murder. And in his explanation, he says exactly what you just brought up a moment ago. That it's not just, we don't just break that commandment when we physically strike our neighbor, when we physically take our neighbor's life. But if I endanger my neighbor, or if I threaten harm to my neighbor, or if I see my neighbor in need and I don't care for them. Interestingly, the same example was given. If I see my neighbor's hunger and I go to bed without feeding them, I've broken the fifth commandment, you shall not murder, because I've not done what's within my power to do for someone who's suffering. So our privilege is a wonderful thing. It's a blessing. It's a gift. But every gift can be used and misused. And when privilege becomes about my rights, then we're misusing the gifts that God's given us. My responsibility is to use those gifts, to steward those gifts. In Christian tradition, we talk often about stewardship, and unfortunately, we too often talk about stewardship as that time of the year where we ask people to donate money to our budget. We're coming up on that time of year now, so it's on my mind. But stewardship, you know, we talk about tithing, giving 10% to the church, but stewardship is about 100% of what God has given me, 100% of my time, 100% of my talents, 100% of my treasures. God cares not just about what I give to the church, but also how I earn my money, that I earn it ethically, how I spend my money, that I spend it wisely, how I save my money, that I'm not being reckless, how I give my money, not just to the church, to the mosque, but to people in need. God cares about 100% of what we do with what God has given us. And spoiler alert, everything we have and everything we are is a gift from God.
One of our online viewers just texted me. He goes, "Man, this guy sounds just like you, but Christian." Praise be to God. You brought up Mr. Rogers, and I remember I was listening to an interview of Mr. Rogers, and there was an African American officer in that show. I don't know if you guys remember Mr. Rogers or not, but Mr. Rogers actually washed this police officer's feet on live television on PBS, and this was actually a very historic moment that a Caucasian male was washing the feet of an African American person. And Mr. Rogers, he fought tooth and nail to keep his to keep PBS alive, and so a lot of people don't know this, but PBS was a great source of sort of bridging the divide during this time between the Caucasians and the African Americans and people of color in general, because this is a time where people were not allowed to go to the same schools, people were not allowed to ride in the same buses, people were not allowed to drink from the same fountains. And so I thought that was very interesting. I had totally forgotten about it until you brought up Mr. Rogers. Another thing is that we actually have a very similar prophetic tradition. We call it a Hadith Qudsi. This is when God speaks on the tongue of the prophet, but it's not put into the Quran. It's a very high level prophetic tradition in which God asks the believers, "I was thirsty and you did not give me drink. I was hungry and you did not give me food. I was sick and you did not come visit me." And so the believer asks God, "How can you be thirsty? How can you be hungry? How can you be sick?" And so the response is, and I'm paraphrasing for the sake of time, is that my creation was thirsty. My creation was hungry. My creation was sick. And so this really brings us right back to the original point that we must have God, right? God doesn't need us. We need God. If we as a civilization, as a society, want to, walk in this path of beauty, we need to stay connected to the divine. And I'm going to say something here that's, a little bit interesting, for the lack of better words. But a lot of people will say, "Hey, look, people of faith are actually very immoral in comparison to people who don't have faith." Right? And my response to that is that, look, just because we say we're believers doesn't mean we are believers, right? Because Islam comes from the verb aslama yuslimu. It means that we submit ourselves, we surrender ourselves, and we bring ourselves into a state of protection and into a state of peace. But the primary meaning is that we I know Muslims can't use the word force anymore, but we force ourselves, not others, right? The Quran clearly says, "La ikraha fi din," there's no compulsion in religion. But we force ourselves to submit our desires to the desires and the will of God. And so when we say Islam, we have, the ing in English, right? Run versus running, right? He ran, he is running. So Islam, in other words, is that we're Islaming. We're continuously forcing ourselves to submit. Now, our society, right, our norms, they're either an evolution of thought or a devolution of thought, right? Thought doesn't come out of absence. And this is a theological dictum. Something cannot come from nothing. Something cannot come from nothing. So if we have any core values that are beautiful, whether we believe in God or not, they're still stemming from the divine. They're still a manifestation of revelation, right? So we may have adopted certain ideas through revelation, from revelation. We may not give the author due credit, right? We may not cite our work, but that is where it's coming from. But the problem is, right? The issue that we face when we unhinge ourselves, right? When we unhinge ourselves from God and we hinge ourselves to societal norms, well, societal norms are completely relative and they're always changing. They can either evolve or they can devolve, right? So 20 years ago, certain things that were acceptable are no longer acceptable, right? And for better or worse, that's a good thing. But certain things that were unacceptable are now acceptable, right? And so we see that in different examples. On certain occasions, it works out really well. On other occasions, we don't know what's going on.
I'm stalling for time. I like your argument there, and I think back again to the creation story in Genesis that I talked about with the first question, and the culmination of the creation is that God creates human beings. God says, "Let us create human beings in our image," and this is not to suggest that God is a little overweight and has a brown beard or anything like that. It's not a physical image. This is rather to suggest that we're created with the attributes, with the qualities of God. You talk about, something can't come from nothing. If we have goodness in us, it's because we've received that from God. If we're lacking that goodness, it tends to be because we've chosen to turn away from the image in which we were created. And so that repair of creation, that return, that repentance, that turning away from sin and back toward God is an act of repairing what's broken in ourselves, in our world, and caring not just for my neighbor, but again, God says that the whole creation is good. And so justice is for my neighbor. Justice is also for making sure that we're being good stewards of the earth and caring for the resources we've been given so that future generations can be as blessed as we have been. Justice is a holistic concept. We have to use the gifts that we've been given to steward those things well and to live into that image in which we were created as best we can.
So we have about 10 minutes left. Now, before we finish, I think maybe in 5 minutes we could do our closing remarks. I just want to ask you guys a question that I had that came to me from someone recently, and I've been thinking about it, and I would see how perhaps you guys would address it from your tradition. So it's common these days for someone to say, I see a lot of injustice, and that's causing me to lose faith. Now, the way that I was kind of raised in the traditional way, I thought that you see injustice or you see wrong, and that might actually cause you to gain faith, right? Something happens to you bad, and you turn to God. But nowadays, you hear that a lot, and I'm not sure, perhaps you guys both work with youth, and so perhaps you've dealt with this. How would you address that from your tradition?
Well, that's an excellent question, and I certainly have heard that a lot, and particularly over the last 7 months, I know a lot of people have wrestled with their faith because there's so much struggle, there's so much pain, and I think you're right. So often, struggle and pain and suffering can really go one of two ways. It can turn you toward God, or it can turn you away from God. And it seems that a lot of people are struggling to turn toward God. I think that often it comes down to this sense of an awareness of God's presence in the middle of these things. When we're in the middle of a storm, it's hard to see the other side of it. My daughter gave me a cold not too long ago. I had a cough, and it's funny because when I have a cold and I've got a cough or a runny nose, there comes a point where I can't remember the last time I didn't have a cough or a runny nose. Now, I know it was last Thursday, but for some reason I can't seem to recall. It just feels like I've always had trouble breathing through my left nostril. It just seems like I've always had this cough. And so when we're in the middle of something, when we're going through something, it's hard to see the other side of it. And I think about one of my favorite stories in the scriptures. It comes from the Hebrew scriptures, the book of 1 Kings. It's about the prophet Elijah. And Elijah has a career that's marked by huge successes and huge revelations of the power of God. And yet, after all that Elijah accomplishes, he flees into the wilderness because his life is being threatened. And he says to God, I'm at the end of my rope. I've done everything I can. I've been so zealous for you. I've done everything you've commanded of me, everything I can do. And no one believes. No one's with me anymore. I give up. And God says to Elijah, hang on just a second. I'm going to come and we're going to talk face to face. And what follows are three classic signs of theophany, three classic signs in the scriptures that God is present. There is a great wind, and this whirlwind rips the mountain apart. There's a fire that consumes everything. There's an earthquake that shakes the mountain at its foundations, and God's not in any of those things. And what I find fascinating about that is there are traditions, ancient Hebrew grieving traditions. We see them reflected in scriptures. That when a person was grieving, they would rend their garments, like the whirlwind tore the mountains in two. That when a person was grieving, they might sit in ashes, just like the fire consumed all around it. When a person was grieving, they might beat their breast in pain and in grief, just like the mountain shook as the earthquake rocked it to its core. God wasn't in any of those things, but creation grieved with Elijah. And then we're told that Elijah noticed, one translation of the Bible, the King James Version, says a still small voice, which is really beautiful and really poetic and really poor translation from the Hebrew. Because what the Hebrew says is Elijah heard the sound of absolute crushing silence. He heard the sound of nothing. And it's in that sound of silence that Elijah noticed God's presence. There's another Jewish grieving practice called sitting Sheva. And the tradition is that when a person is experiencing grief, when they've lost a loved one, they sit in silence for as long as 7 days. And people come and sit with them and share their presence, but they're not permitted to speak until the mourner speaks to them. So they can sit in silence, they can share in the grief, they can share in the presence, but they don't speak until they've been addressed. What I love about this passage is that Elijah notices God's presence in the sound of crushing silence. But God does not speak until Elijah goes out to meet God. Elijah addresses God first. The Lord of all creation sits Sheva with Elijah's grief. And I think that so often when we're in the middle of it, we don't notice God being the closest one to us in our grief. God is so close to us that we can't see God's presence with us. There's a very prominent Christian pastor whose name I'm forgetting right now. That's going to come back to bite me, I'm sure. But he suffered a tragedy. His son was involved in a single car accident, drove off the side of a cliff, and died in this accident. And he said that he believed that God's tears were the first ones shed for his son's death. That God was the first one, before anyone else even knew of his passing, God was grieving for his son. And so I think there's such beauty to that God knows our pain every bit as intimately as we do. The Christian tradition holds that Jesus is God made incarnate, that God took on flesh and lived a human life, knowing intimately, personally, firsthand, what it feels like to be lonely, to be hungry, to be grieving, to be tortured and in pain. The scriptures talk about Jesus weeping when his friend Lazarus died, even though in just a few verses he would call Lazarus back out of the tomb. He knew he was going to bring Lazarus back from the dead, but he allowed himself to grieve because grief is human. And I think with people turning away from God in the midst of suffering, in the midst of grief, it's because we've stopped learning how to listen to that sound of sheer silence. We've started to assume that just because we can't see or can't hear God, God must not be with us. When really the opposite is true. Rick Warren. Thank goodness that came before we were done. Rick Warren.
So part of me wants to address this from a theological perspective, because that's what personally gives me comfort. I was a very confused person at some point, and I had to learn my religion properly and comprehensively to understand all of these different things. But, in a nutshell, if I think about it, like the moment I think about how do you deal with faith during turbulence, there's no amount of theology that's going to correct it, right? And I immediately, my thought went straight to Abraham. And, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says in the Quran, قُلْنَا يَا نَارُ كُونِي بَرْدًا وَسَلَامًا, right? That when Abraham was flung into the fire, he had surrendered, right? He had surrendered to the will of God. And because he had surrendered to the will of God, I mean, there's nothing more, tormenting that I can think of than being flung into an abominable fire, right? There's nothing I can think about that could beat that. Do you have any other examples? I don't know, right? And so he's being flung into the fire, and God tells the fire to become a cool fire, right? And become a peaceful place. Now, there's a lot of theology behind all of this that gives me a lot of comfort, and I'm going to try to explain it in a very quick response, that the fire had no power. The fire had no power. It's God that controls the quality of that fire. So for God to change that fire into something that is warm, to something that is cool, it's not a miracle per se, right? In the modern definition of the term, because everything is dependent upon God for its power. There's no power outside of the power of God. Now, the second example that comes to my mind is that of Job, Ayub, peace and blessings be upon him, who spent most of his life in a torturous plague. And when finally he was given health, he was asked, which days were better? The days you were sick or the days in which you were healthy? And he said, without thinking twice, that the days in which I was sick. And the people said, how? Why? Why would you say that? He said, because every single day, God used to ask, hey, Ayub, how are you doing? And that would make the pain and the suffering worthwhile. So pain and suffering, trials and tribulations, these are part and parcel of this world. Just the word dunya, the Arabic word for this world, means something that's lowly, something that is full of difficulty. And so it really should not cause us to lose faith. It really shouldn't, because God never promised a beautiful reality in this world. That never happened, right? And God is not bound to anything. I mean, He could have done whatever He wants. He could have made us do whatever we want. He could have made us look like whatever we want. He did not even have to give us the promise of heaven. He's not bound by anything. It's only through His love and His mercy. This is a training ground. This is a testing ground. And so if we want to I mean, honestly, like when we look at the prophetic examples of majority of the prophets, and none come to mind except for Solomon, peace and blessings be upon him, Sulaiman alayhi salatu wasalam, who was, extravagantly sort of in a very, very beautiful state, in beautiful condition. And also Dawood alayhi salatu wasalam, David, But other than that, majority of the prophets, they faced a lot of trials and tribulations. So if our idea is that when we become very faithful and when we become very righteous, our reality will automatically just become beautiful, then our understanding is wrong. What it is that when we become righteous and we connect ourselves to God, we will be able to burden the reality of this world. And so there's a verse in the Quran that I feel like it's quoted a lot, but not comprehensively explained. So God says, I will never burden a soul more than it can handle. That's not unequivocally, right? That's not without any qualification. A soul can't just wake up and burden everything. It has to do it through God, right? So any challenge that we're faced with, if we do it with God, through God, then we will see the other end of it. And we will be able to overcome that challenge. Now, when we go at it alone, that's when the alcohol comes into place. That's where the drugs come into place. That's where all of the other things come into place, is because we're so burdened, because we're trying to burden a mountain by ourselves when God is willing to give us a crane, right? That's just the reality of the matter. And so there's this concept of the golden mean, both in spirituality, Islamic spirituality, and in sociology, right? Who would have thought? Right? So when we talk about anthropology and sociology, we have this concept of the golden mean. The golden mean is basically that when there's a challenge of the right magnitude, it has within it the ability to revitalize a nation, revive a nation, right? And so if we plug that into spirituality, and Islamic spirituality for that matter, every challenge, if done through God, is an opportunity to revive ourselves, to revitalize ourselves. Now, when we talk specifically in Islamic spirituality, the golden mean is that the intellect governs the emotions and the desires. And the intellect is governed by the Quran. Now, what happens is our emotions tell us that if God loved me, why would he continue to test me? But our intellect is what tells us that God tested the prophets. I mean, there was no, in the Islamic faith, there's no human being that was more beloved to God than the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. And he lost his father before he was born. He lost his mother at the age of 5 or 6 in the middle of nowhere. Okay, he buried most of his children. He buried every single one of his male heirs in his life. And any one of these things can cause one to lose their mind, right? So the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, saw every trial and tribulation that we can think of. So when we say that we're going to lose faith because God is testing us beyond what we have calculated as something that we can handle, then our emotions have taken control of our intellect. And so we have removed ourselves from this golden mean of Islamic spirituality.
You say that there's no theology that's going to save you in the middle of that. You're so right. And I love what you just said. And I think that as you were talking, what occurred to me is that a lot of times, I talk about God being close to us in our suffering. What can so often make the difference is having other people close to us in our suffering. I've said a couple of times, we are our sibling's keeper. We have a responsibility to one another. And if you'll permit me, I know we're short on time, but one of the areas of my great passion is addiction and recovery. I'm a recovering self-injured myself. All through high school, college, I cut myself as a way of dealing with anxiety, depression, some things that I didn't know how to handle. And when I was in my freshman year of college, I came to a place where I was really having a crisis of faith. I was brought up in the church. I had what I thought was a strong background. I knew a lot of scripture. I really had great church trivia and not a whole lot of great faith. But I had people who came alongside me during those times when I was really struggling. And they were people who I really didn't know very well. I went to school first time around at a place where I didn't have any friends. I felt really alone. But my neighbor in the dormitories would come over and pray with me because he knew I was going through a hard time. And I had a friend who lived across the campus who would take walks with me every once in a while and just sort of talk about what was going on. And there was a day where I was just so overwhelmed, and I just broke down while I was doing my laundry. I was absolutely sobbing in the laundry room. And my RA, who I'd really never spoken more than 3 words to in my life, came in and saw me crying and just held me. And it was such a powerful moment of presence, of having someone there to accept that I was broken in that moment and that I wasn't alone in that brokenness. And I'll bring this back to justice, because I received from them something that I couldn't do for myself in that moment. And once I began the recovery journey for myself, I had a choice. I could try to bury this thing that was kind of embarrassing in my past that I don't really like to admit to. I could try to just pretend it didn't happen and move on with my life. And I'm blessed that for 8 years of self-injury, I really don't carry a lot of visible scars. Or I could use my experience to try to help other people who were going through what I went through. And 2 years ago, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America had their triannual, every 3 years, their national youth gathering in Houston. And 30,000 Lutheran youth came to the NRG Center. And I was given an opportunity to speak to them. And I spoke about my past with self-injury and recovery, and the way that God was present to me while I was hurting myself and while I was seeking recovery. I had a gift that I was given. I had a second chance that I really didn't deserve. And I was able to use that to speak to 30,000 young people, so many of whom in the last 2 years have reached out to me and said, I saw your talk at the NRG Stadium, and I've been struggling with something similar. Can we talk about it? Or who have said, I heard this is something that you're familiar with. My friend is going through this, and I don't know how to help them. What can you tell me? And so my faith was saved because there were people who were willing to stand with me and accept my brokenness and remind me that I wouldn't always be broken. And because I was given that gift, now I have a responsibility. I can use that gift that I was given to help other people who are going through what I went through. And that right there is justice.
What you just said, I think, is very, very powerful. And I say this a lot. And this is, a lot of the advice I give to people is advice I give to myself as well, and advice that's been given to me from my teachers. And that's why I don't pretend to be flawless, because it's injustice to do that. There was no perfect being on this earth except, we have the prophets that were saved from sin, and that too for a theological reason. But what we do when we're met with adversity in life, the first thing that we do is we remove ourselves from the circle of normalcy, that, oh no, I'm no longer normal, right? That because I have this problem or I have that problem, I am not normal. I am, God has me under a magnifying glass, and, we begin to judge ourselves before God has begun the process of judgment. And I hear this a lot from people. Why is God doing this to me? Or, how come that person has this blessing and I don't have this blessing? So everybody is struggling with something. And it's just different. We are all struggling with something. If somebody is financially well established, they may not have the business sense, right? And if they have the business sense, they may not have the finances. And if they have both the business sense and the finances, they may be suffering from something at home, right? But we all have issues. And so for us, the most dangerous thing that I know of is that when we remove ourselves from the circle of normalcy, that, oh no, something is wrong with me. I remember I asked one of my teachers, I was like 16, 17 years old, and I said, I feel like I'm possessed. Right? And, anything I want to do, if it's wrong, somehow I'm able to manage to do it no matter what. So I feel like I'm having demonic, reliance or something, right? And so he said, no, that just means you're intelligent. Right? If you start using yourself towards goodness, you will be able to achieve even more, right? You will be able to achieve even loftier goals. And so a lot of times we think that maybe there's this demonic intervention that is happening in our lives, when in reality it's literally we have broken away from this concept of the golden mean, where our emotions or our desires have overtaken ourselves. And we just need to bring that back into balance. And I feel like it would be injustice for us to leave this without offering a semi-solution, right? The first step in the right direction is turning back to God, right? Just turning back to God. And I don't mean that in the sense of reading a passage in Arabic, right? I mean literally taking your heart and dumping it, at the doorstep of God and being like, Ya Allah, oh God, I need help, right? I need help. And I remember I called one of my friends and said, how do you talk to God? And they're like, you're doing it right now. Now, if you took it from the literal perspective, you may have some issues, right? But obviously that's not what the conversation was. The conversation was, you were seeking God, you have found. Not that I am God, right? But that now that you're because your intention is God, whatever now you communicate is to God. We don't have intermediaries, right? We don't have walls and nothing of that nature. And so turn back to God and you will find yourself coming closer to the golden mean. This is also why we limited it to 2 faith traditions.
Just closed it on me, man. You just closed the mic on me. Okay, so I mean, personally, okay, so I guess lastly, I'd like to thank you guys for both sharing personal stories. I mean, it comes from a position of strength. So I think we've gone over time a little bit, and so with your permissions, I'd like to close the event. So thanks a lot again for making yourself available, Pastor. For the Imam, I'd like to thank him too, but it's his mosque, so it's a little bit different. And I'd like to also thank the audience for joining us and also online. And I pray that you guys also pray for us and for the community. And I hope this plague is finished soon, and that we get a break from different politics for a little while. And so, all right. Well, with that, I'd like to finish. Thank you.
Thank you.